It was a mild spring day in the romantic Hudson River Valley. The sun made the water of the Hudson sparkle like silver, and the steep, forested hillsides glowed with fresh green leaves. Emily and Michael, a couple in their mid-40s from upstate New York, had decided to spend a long weekend in the historic towns of Beacon and Cold Spring. They loved this area, the old estates and castles along the river, the narrow, winding streets, and especially the legendary cliffs of the Hudson Highlands. After breakfast at their cozy bed and breakfast, they set out. First, they drove and then hiked up to the famous overlook on Storm King Mountain. The trail was steep, but well worth it. Step by step, they climbed the several hundred feet of elevation. The woods smelled of moss and pine, and every small clearing offered breathtaking views of the Hudson River far below, winding like a silver ribbon through the gorge. When they reached the top, they stood at the viewpoint and let the wind blow through their hair. Hundreds of feet above the river, up here, you felt a little closer to heaven. Incredible, isn't it? Michael said softly, putting his arm around his wife. Emily just nodded. They stood in silence for a while, soaking in the vastness. Then they made their way back down the same path, slowly, with wobbly knees but full hearts. Back at the bottom, they got in the car and drove the short distance to the riverside sculpture in Cold Spring. The bronze figure of the Hudson River Maiden stood majestically on the end of a stone pier. With her outstretched arms and flowing form, she seemed to be calling out, or warning, the boats passing by, just like in the old local legends. Emily and Michael parked in the small riverside lot and walked closer. The Hudson murmured gently, and seagulls circled overhead. Not far from the sculpture, right along the riverside path, stood a simple wooden bench, and on that bench sat a young woman. She looked to be in her early 30s. Her face was strikingly pretty. Large, expressive eyes, full lips, and soft features. But her body told a different story. She was clearly overweight, almost obese. The woman gazed out at the river, and as Emily and Michael drew nearer, they saw that her cheeks were wet with tears. She quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand when she heard their footsteps. She didn't want strangers to see her like this. But Emily and Michael immediately sensed it. Here was someone in deep distress. Michael stopped, smiled kindly, and asked gently, "Excuse me, are you okay? Is there anything we can do to help?" The young woman shook her head. "No, thank you, it's fine." Her voice sounded thick and uncertain, but Emily could tell she actually wanted to talk. There was a silent cry for someone to listen in her eyes. Michael felt it too. He said softly, "You don't have to tell us anything if you don't want to. We can just sit here for a moment if that's all right with you." The woman hesitated briefly, then nodded. Emily and Michael sat down on either side of her on the bench. For a while, no one spoke. There was only the sound of the river lapping and the gulls crying. Suddenly, the words poured out of the young woman. I'm so unhappy. Every time I sit here and look at the River Maiden, this beautiful, slender woman, I see myself. And I see how impossible I look, how ugly, how shapeless. It's so bad. I can't stand myself anymore. Her voice trembled. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. Emily gently placed a hand on her arm. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah, may I ask you something?" Michael said carefully. "Do you really think that about yourself? Or do you feel like that's how others see you? Is there something heavy weighing on your heart?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Both, but mostly me. I know exactly why I am this way. I eat way too much sweets. Every day at least a bag of gummy bears. And then chocolate, cake, ice cream, whatever's there. It's like an addiction. I start and I can't stop. And afterward, I hate myself for it." Emily and Michael simply listened. They didn't interrupt. When Sarah paused, Michael said calmly, "Sarah, there is help, really. But we've both learned in our own lives that the deepest and best help first comes from a completely different source. We rely first and foremost on Jesus. At the word Jesus, Sarah flinched. Her eyes widened in fear, almost panic. She stared down at her hands. Emily noticed and asked gently, "Have you ever had anything to do with Jesus?" Sarah nodded hesitantly. "Yes, I actually knew him. I was even pretty strong in my faith before, but then I drifted away, far away. I did things I'm not proud of. I prayed and then stopped. Eventually I thought, he doesn't want me anymore, not like I am now." Emily smiled warmly. "Sarah, that's exactly what's so beautiful about Jesus. He waits. He doesn't run away from you. You can come back to him anytime, just as you are. You can tell him everything, even the things you're ashamed of. You can ask for forgiveness for the time you drifted away. He forgives, and he makes things new." Michael added, "And when you do that, you can also start making practical changes. For example, I've been eating almost no added sugar for a few years now. Just minimal amounts. No sugar in my tea or coffee, no sweetened drinks. That helped me the most. Not overnight, but step by step. The body adjusts, and the mind becomes freer." Sarah listened attentively. In her eyes, fear, hope, and a quiet longing mixed together. They talked for a good half-hour more. About guilt and grace. About addiction and freedom. About the difference between "I have to do this alone" and "I'm allowed to accept help" from God and from people. When it was time to say goodbye, they exchanged phone numbers. Emily gave Sarah a warm hug. "You're not alone, okay? Reach out any time you want." Then Emily and Michael continued on their way. Sarah stayed on the bench for a long time, looking at the River Maiden statue. But this time she wasn't crying out of despair. Something inside her had quietly stirred. 4 weeks later, Emily's phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. "Dear Emily, dear Michael, I just had to write you. In the past few weeks, I did what you said. I came back to Jesus. I told him everything. My shame, my addiction, how far I had drifted. And you know what? I felt forgiveness. A real, deep relief. I also took your advice about sugar. No more gummy bears, no more junk sweets. It was hard at first, but now it already feels normal. In these 4 weeks, I've lost almost 9 pounds. I feel lighter, not just physically. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart. You gave me hope." Emily and Michael were overjoyed. They replied right away and stayed in occasional contact. Several months later came another message, this time with a photo. Sarah stood in front of a mirror. She looked noticeably slimmer. Her face was radiant. "I can hardly believe it myself. I look really good now. And you know what's the best part? I actually feel pretty, beautiful. Not perfect, but valuable. The River Maiden is still out there, but I don't compare myself to her anymore. I compare myself to the woman God wants to make me. That's how God heals, body and soul. Thank you for not just walking past that day." Emily read the message aloud, and Michael smiled and nodded. That's exactly what Jesus does. He meets us in the most unexpected places, even on a bench by the Hudson, in the shadow of the River Maiden. And so, an encounter that was supposed to be just a short walk turned into the beginning of a new life. A life in which a woman learned that true beauty doesn't lie in the figure of a legend, but in the freedom that comes when you return to the arms of the one who has loved you from the very beginning. Suscríbete al canal para más historias auténticas, conmovedoras y llenas de fe.